Yes. So, hello and welcome everybody. We are starting the live feed of this conversation we had in mind with Jason Gold. I will introduce him a little bit, but first just about the frames of where we are and how we do it. So ideally, this is a campaign method, thinking about a little bit on the past, what happened during the Holocaust times in the Second World War in Europe, but also what led to that and what can we learn from the past, because we are around the 9th of November, which is a commemoration day of the Kristallnacht, the Germans, when Germany and the German state decided that Jewish property was not anymore safe by law. And in many countries, many cities of Germany, pogroms started against Jewish property and violence on the street. And some consider it the beginning of the violent phase of the Holocaust, which led eventually to the death of millions in Europe. And this was 1938, and of course 80 years passed, but we also can consider nowadays as a forefront to the 30s. Many people consider the times of the European Union's collapse, or at least shattering, with Brexit and many other countries turning against the European fundamental values. Consider it as a pretext to maybe a new era of stronger populism and even wars and similar tendencies of genocide or lack of solidarity of nowadays. And at United, we campaigned for decades against anti-Semitism and fascism, and used the 9th of November as a commemorative day, and also to highlight the trends and what's going on in Europe, and what do we consider, or United considers, a backlash and the return of these evil monstrosities and ideologies that we consider fascism and neo-Nazism per se. And for this year, we thought to talk a little bit about hope, not just talk about hate and the suffering and commemorative methods, but also to think a little bit ahead and think about the good stuff, everything that goes on and tries to combat this anti-Semitism and populism and extreme right-wing narrative that is very present in today's social media and media in general. So we thought, let's talk with people, interesting people that are actually have a history of combating anti-Semitism, have a history of facing similar threats and challenges. And we decided to go with Jason Gold, who is, in short, a war photographer, but at the same time also a political activist and journalist, and a witness to a lot of wars and human societies collapses a little bit, but also has an experience on building together alliances and many people to combat those things that happen. And I know that this is not an official biography of you, Jason, but I'm very happy that you are with us. And of course, I will ask you questions about your work, and through that, you can introduce yourself more properly. So I read your bio, and the first thing that I read about was the apartheid. And it's interesting to see that actually this is one of the historical political structures that not so many people are familiar with. When they ask people about the Holocaust nowadays, the 18-year to 25-year-olds, half of them don't really know what that word means or what happened there. And I believe that when it comes to the apartheid, the percentage is even lower. So can you tell me a little bit how you got in touch with this topic, the resistance against the apartheid, and what the apartheid actually was? Tell it to me like I never heard about it. Of course I did, but I'm curious of your take, and I think a lot of people should hear it from a witness that was present in that time.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate you on the work that your organization has been doing for quite a considerable time. And I think it's really important to have international collaborations and to outreach to as wide an audience as possible. For me, the apartheid movement, or rather the anti-apartheid movement, was a movement for justice and a movement for equality. In South Africa, the non-whites were very much treated as second, third-class citizens with virtually no rights, and were struggling for their emancipation. The white settlers of South Africa were aided and abetted by outside governments and so on to exploit and to subjugate in normal colonial kind of activities. I got involved with the anti-apartheid movement. I was lucky enough to live in an area of London, Muswell Hill, in the 1970s, which was a little bit of a hotbed for social activism at that time. And I felt that the cause was very just, and I felt that just because it was in another part of the world, it shouldn't exclude me for standing up for what I believed to be right. And I was, quite young and impressionable. I'm very happy that I was impressed by the right kind of attitudes, and I was able to contribute in a small way, but nevertheless, I was able to contribute to developing a narrative within the UK that, we should boycott South African goods, we should organise help for, people in South Africa who were suffering, and generally fighting the British establishment's position of trying to maintain the status quo. I didn't see it as any different to the struggles that disenfranchised people in my own country were going through. South Africa was much more violent, of course, and it was much more oppressive. But in essence, it's about big people hitting little people with big sticks. And that's something that really sparked my activities and interest.
Sometimes literally, because the South African police was very violent when it came to protests. Have you been to South Africa in this time? So did you travel there also?
No, I haven't. During the apartheid regime, I wouldn't go to South Africa because I didn't want to contribute economically to a system which I was appalled by. And then as things became calmer and the struggle was nearing its conclusion, other activities took over my life, and I just haven't had the opportunity to go there. It is somewhere that I would very much like to go.
And I have a question which relates also to the 30s and to apartheid and generally about these movements, and I'm curious of your opinion. What makes history? Heroes make history, or history makes heroes? What do you think?
Winners make history.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to resistance also, like, what do you think? Like, are those people that are seen, like in case of the apartheid movement, also we see like Nelson Mandela, or we see a lot of other younger activists that were struggling, were in prison. So what do you think? Do these personalities grow from the pressure of history, or they are somehow born with some sort of solidarity or something that makes them, drives them towards this role?
I think that very often people develop their ideas and they develop their attitudes, which in the end doesn't allow them emotionally or intellectually to just sit back and do nothing. And they feel an obligation. That's kind of what's driven me throughout my life. I feel obligated. And I don't think people like Steve Biko or Nelson Mandela, or you can name hundreds of people from South Africa, I don't think they do things in order to become historical or iconic figures. I think it's an innate sensitivity towards a moral imperative. And in fact, most of these people were also very sensitive to struggles of other people in other countries, because that sensitivity it transfers to an international dimension.
I think this sensitivity is a very good word, because we were talking a lot about what could drive others also to join the fights or the actions that we do, and maybe this type of sensitivity is a very interesting thing. Do you think you also have this sensitivity and you work with a lot of people? Is it a curse or a blessing? What do you think?
It depends how I wake up in the morning, you know. It doesn't matter if it's a curse or a blessing, it's an obligation. I was brought up to believe that the world was my country and to do good was my religion, and that you don't need to be a card-carrying member of any particular political party to have certain moral imperatives and a sense of what is right and wrong. And I think that it's something that you feel in your bones. It's something that if you're receptive enough to those around you, you pick up, you learn, you develop. I was very lucky in my formative years. I had some very good mentors, people who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, people who were members of the Communist Party of Great Britain in the 1930s, 1940s, and went through all the trials and tribulations that meant, the blacklisting, you know, not being able to get work and so on and so forth. And so I was inspired from a very early age. And I think many people in my position probably have a similar story. There was not one particular moment of nirvana, you know, my eyes are suddenly open. It's a process.
And in the 90s in Hungary, actually, we didn't have so much clearly what is race, and we didn't know anything about who is a Roma or who is Jewish in the class. But there was always, from the teachers and from the system, there was always a pressure on children with minority background. And somehow, automatically, you had to make a choice if you are supporting these kids or you are standing on the side of the system that is pressuring them and objectively creating this distinction between who is a Roma and who isn't, because it was always them who were first called in when something went missing in the school. So we didn't know that the reason of this is that their heritage or their origin, but somehow it was always the same children. So it took me quite some years to actually remember these situations and consider it racism, because when you are a child, you don't know what is racism. You are not aware of the phenomenon unless you are a victim of it, because then you know very well.
Absolutely. And actually, I remember when I was 9 years old, so a long time ago, 56 years ago, my parents moved from what was predominantly quite a Jewish area of London to white middle-class suburban London. And it was also at an age when one was changing schools in the British system. And I remember coming home from school one day, not long after we moved, and someone had graffitied on my parents' house, "This is a Jew's house." And, you know, this is in the 1960s in middle-class suburban London. So I guess even subconsciously from a very early age, being a victim of anti-Semitism. And then later, you know, as a 20-year-old something, with the mentors that I mentioned earlier, the previous experiences kind of connected. And so my path had been an ongoing process since a very early age. Unlike yourself, you said, you know, as a child, you knew there was something wrong, but you can get a fix on it.
You don't know that you're doing it, but you did already political activism when you are very little. Now we can turn a little bit the page of history and come to the 90s as well with Yugoslavia, because this is where you made a lot of experience with war photography, right? When did you start to go there, and how was it for you?
I first went to Sarajevo April the 9th, 1992. So it was days after, just literally days after the initial barricades went up. From 92 until 95, I was in and out of Sarajevo and all the surrounding suburbs. I was in Bosnia, in other parts, in Croatia, an area called Knin. What took me there really was the British media was so full of one side of the conflict. I just couldn't accept that any conflict was one-sided in the sense of having protagonists. And I knew for a fact that a lot of volunteers going over to the Croatian side were less than savory characters in the UK. A lot of people from the British National Party and you know, pretty horrible people. And I thought to myself, I need to get there to see what's going on. And it was my first war experience. And one of the things that struck me was not the blood and guts, of which there is none in any of my photographs. I was not interested in blood and guts. For me, if you're a soldier, that's what you end up with if you fire guns and cannons and tanks and things. I was much more interested in the pathos of war. How does a kid go to school? How do mothers hang their washing out? How do you go about normal activity? Because not everyone in a war is a gun-toting xenophobe or nationalist. You know, if there was a barricade in the middle of my street where I live, wherever that may be, I would be on one side or the other of a conflict. But it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily a combatant. And I was really interested in, for example, one of my images of a soldier sitting on the front of a tank. He's holding a Kalashnikov and his hands are beautifully manicured. I mean, like really beautiful fingers. And he's holding this Kalashnikov as if it's a violin. But like this, not like a violin, but he's cradling it with his hands. And I just couldn't get over the contrast of this quite elderly guy, maybe in his 50s, who really, he was no soldier. You could see his face, you could see his eyes. And these beautiful hands. And I thought, this is really a side of a war that people ignore. That there, but for the grace of God, go any of us.
It's a type of contrast of normality and beauty and the terror in one image. Yeah, and war is full of these contrasts, definitely. But I'm also a little bit interested on your take, or like let's hear you. What do you think went wrong in Yugoslavia? So how come that from like if we were neighbors, of course, so I was a little bit closer to Yugoslavia, and my family went there. It was for us the most Western country in the Barak, meaning that the beaches were beautiful, the food was very good, there was much less poverty than all over the Eastern European countries. And then suddenly, 5 years after the changes, it was a war-torn country, and genocide happened on multiple occasions, and ethnic cleansing. So what do you think, how from 1990 to 95, in 5 years, this all broke down in a way? Like, what led to that? What do you think?
I think the war, as far as I can make out, and I've been pretty much involved with Yugoslavia ever since those days. When Slovenia went, and in the end, Slovenia was never really Slav, it was much more Austro-Hungarian in the context of Yugoslavia. When Slovenia went, nobody in the media was talking about what religion ethnic Slovenes were. It began as a kind of war of national identity. And Slovenia it went early, there was a few difficulties, but in the end, it went pretty peacefully. And I think that changed a little bit later when Izetbegovic and Tudjman went to Washington and had meetings with Finn, who were a PR company at that time. I don't know if they still exist. And they had some pretty huge contracts in America. And Finn advised both Tudjman and Izetbegovic to change the dynamic of the war from a war of national identity into a war of religious identity. And then, of course, it becomes very emotional because people's religion, by and large, is a private matter. And their religion is being exposed as a reason for attacking someone else or vice versa. And I think things began to get out of hand then. And you started seeing pretty well 99% of the media publishing photos of peasant women, and I mean peasant not in a pejorative sense, I mean peasant in the sense of women who worked the land and so on. You know, coming out of the region with the black scarves and you know, dressed in black and so on, and you being, you know, close to the region, you would know that's normal attire in, you know, of women who work on the land. And there was this constant, you know, Muslim refugees escaping atrocities. And the narrative of this new religious dynamic was cemented. You know, nobody really paid much attention to the fact that, you know, tens of thousands of Jews came out of Sarajevo very early on, but it didn't serve the purpose because the notion of Muslims being oppressed was the narrative of Izetbegovic, and the notion of Serbs being the aggressors was the narrative of Tujman. And the one truth in war is that the enemy's enemy is my friend. I think it also, I witnessed personally Croats and Serbs fighting Muslims, Muslims and Croats fighting Serbs. It depended on which part of Yugoslavia you were, where the front lines were.
And do you think it was the leaders' fault, like the two main head of states? It was a war of that, or it was a tension that was already built up before? So the two leaders just pressed the start button, and they didn't have to insert the violence.
I think it was partly both, because there was the hiatus between Tito's death and the breakage of Yugoslavia. We know what happened with Stan Balint and others. It was also a time of great power play within the region. It was just after the Berlin Wall had come down. Germany needed to expand its influence, so it picked up again on its old satellites like Croatia, for example. Britain was trying to play its usual role as, the honest broker. Douglas Hurd was trying to develop some kind of peace plan quite early on. Russia, of course, with its influence in Serbia, the French just selling arms to everybody. And, it was something that took on a life of its own. And then later, with the Croatia wanting to get its independence, I think it was more than a coincidence of agendas. I'm not somebody who believes in conspiracies, but it coincided with Britain wanting to opt out of the social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty. And if you remember at that time, the treaty had to be signed in totality. You couldn't just pick and choose. It would either get signed or it would fall. And I think it's fair to say that a deal was done between Germany and the UK, that if the UK followed Germany in recognising Croatia, Germany would allow the UK to opt out of the social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty. And I think, you also had the other agenda of which currency was going to dominate in the region. Half of it was Deutschmark, you know that from your period in Hungary. Half of it was a dollar, black market. And there were lots of things going on at that time. So I think post-Croatia's independence, things took on yet another dimension.
Hungary was partly selling weapons actually to Croatia illegally. It was sanctioned after, and that time the prime minister said that I had to do this because this was the expectation of the West. So fueling the conflict with illegal weapon sales from the West is quite not a conspiracy, but something that admittedly happened in time. How do you see it? Can we recognize these type of dangers ahead? Were there people who said, if you go that direction, the end is going to be a civil war and genocide? And why we don't listen to these people if there were these people?
Or when you say we, do you mean the West?
Yeah, like the world. Let's say Europe. It depends on the we.
Partly because of our arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
We feel we are, we are more politically intellectual than people in the Balkans. We are more sophisticated. We played this game before with the Balkans. Look what happened in 1918. We allowed Serbia to subjugate the Kingdom of Montenegro. When Montenegro became independent in 2006, unlike all the other constituent parts of ex-Yugoslavia, it was not finding itself a new independent nation. It was re-establishing its statehood. You know, as a result of the end of the First World War, the great powers allowed Serbia to subjugate the Kingdom of Montenegro. And so, you know, we've played this game before in the Balkans, nothing new. And in fact, we've been playing it very recently, vis-a-vis Vucic and what he's doing here in Montenegro.
Yeah, it seems that the Balkans is just a never-ending hotbed for conflict. But do you think this comes from some sort of cultural heritage, or just so many nations live so close to each other with very different cultural background, like as you mentioned, the religious background, some Catholics, some Muslims, some Orthodox. So what makes the Balkans such a hotbed? What do you think?
Well, I think after Tito, and as you alluded to earlier, Yugoslavia was seen as, you know, a shining light in the communist world. My wife, I'm married to a Montenegrin. My wife, as a teenager, could go to Moscow or Washington without a visa. You know, they had credit cards here long before many other parts of the ex-communist world. The education system here was really good. You know, Tito's Yugoslavia, far from perfect, of course, and, you know, many would say lots of problems and so on and so forth, but it was a, you know, pretty good place to live within the context of Eastern Europe. And even if you look at wider Europe, you know, it wasn't a bad place. And then you had this vacuum after his death. And political vacuums are generally filled by right-wing nationalists. We see that now in recent years with right-wing populists. And, you know, we can even look at the UK, you know, after the Blair government, there became a political vacuum. There's no longer political discourse, really. It's just either one idea or a lesser version of the same idea. There's no real alternative being offered. And we saw what happened when, you know, Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party and the real alternative was being offered. It was, you know, wall-to-wall, day-to-day coverage trying to destroy an individual. You know, nobody was really trying to destroy the politics, because a majority of people actually liked the politics of renationalising, you know, the railways and so on and so on. And so, you know, when there's a political vacuum, there's always right-wing nationalists or populists waiting to fill it. And I think that went wrong here. And right-wing always use whatever vehicle they can. You know, in the UK, Brexit is a great example. The right always make these fictitious enemies into straw men, burn them down, masquerade it as some great patriotic act, where actually it's just a xenophobic nationalist act. You know, that's what happened with Brexit, in my opinion. And here, you know, Serbia's been doing that with the Serb Orthodox Church here in Montenegro, which incidentally is not even registered as a church here, does not pay taxes here. Its priests can come here without visas. And, you know, the amount of land that they own and churches that they own, because after the subjugation of the Kingdom of Montenegro in 1980, in 1919, a year later, the Serb Orthodox Church subsumed the Montenegro Orthodox Church, you know, and then took over the monasteries and the churches and so on and so on. And so, you know, it's not that there's a collective intellectual fault It's just that there's been a political vacuum. And political vacuums are invariably filled by the right. And the right will use whatever vehicle it can in order to achieve its objective, which generally speaking is to undermine social democracy, because social democracy equals accountability.
Larger solidarity.
Yeah.
Also, when we come to, and that's the end of the Yugoslavian trail, 99, the NATO intervention in Serbia, Yugoslavia, and Kosovo, and the military intervention by the West stopped the Yugoslavian fall apart, and then finally, really, Yugoslavia fell into pieces. How do you see that? Was the West within reason to intervene, and how people from the region see it? Like, was it a right intervention or was it a wrong intervention?
Well, I think it depends what people you ask. You know, Serbs see it as, you know, a wrong intervention, but Serbs have this collective victimhood. You know, one of their greatest celebratory days is the glorious defeat of Kosovo. They have as part of their collective psyche a notion of victimhood. And so NATO bombing Serbia, and actually NATO bombed Montenegro too, I might add. It kind of just reignited this Serb nationalism. And I'm sorry to go on about Serbs and so on, but they are the largest group in ex-Yugoslavia. And in the last very short period of time, have been re-embarking upon the doctrines of Milosevic. And instead of calling it Greater Serbia, they're calling it Serbian world. But, you know, the international community are not actually understanding who President Vučić is. He is the protege of Vojislav Šešelj. And we all know, well, we should know what Vojislav Šešelj was up to in the 1990s.
Interestingly enough, there are a lot of parallelities with Hungary, because we also have an image of the so-called Great Hungary that incorporates parts of Yugoslavia or Serbia as well. And formerly, it was the Kingdom of Hungary, for a 1,000-year kingdom. And even in periods of time, it was a very influential nation in Europe. But after the First World War, being part of the Austro-Hungarian kingdom, it fell apart. And then what left is 1/3 of the previous area of the Hungarian kingdom. And not surprisingly, this victimhood, as you mentioned with the Serbian victimhood, the Hungarian victimhood is also celebrating a lot of losses. Most of our celebrations are actually, our national holidays are connected to lost revolutions, 56 revolution or the 1848 revolution against the Austrians. So we have a very similar past in that aspect. And also we have a very similar government in that aspect. Nationalists that are tuning on this kind of hurt feeling, emotional backlash from the past. Do you see them also similar? Like, is there a lot of comparatives? What do you think?
Yeah, very much so. It's really interesting to hear you, a Hungarian, saying that, because, you know, I felt that for a long time, and it's really a pleasure to hear someone as objective about their own as I am about my own. You know, I say I don't fly for anyone except the good people. And you know, for me, the world is my country, and that's it. And I think there really are similarities between Vučić and Orban and others. And
they are also very good friends. by the way.
Of course, and you could go further. You could look at Jair Bolsonaro. You could look at Nigel Farage. You could look at Boris Johnson. You could look at Babish. You could look at Janša. You could look at Donald Trump. You could look at those at the head of the PIS party in Hungary. And in the end, when you take the lines backwards from the front of these people, the lines are all going to the same place. They're going to Steve Bannon, they're going to Jim Dawson. It's movement, it's Knights Templar International. And you in Hungary know all about Jim Dawson and Knights Templar International. And, this is an organization that was set up by somebody, actually, he claims it was set up by his sister-in-law, and he claims to have nothing to do with it. But Dawson actually had a political party that was prescribed in the UK. Within a very short period of time, Knights Templar International will appear on the scene, and the clue is in the name. He was living in Hungary for quite a while, and then went to Serbia. And so the story goes, MI6 instructed Vučić to kick him out. And then Dawson appears in Kosovo. And this is an organization that is incredibly wealthy, that it predominantly is financed by members of the KKK, members of Putin's Night Wolves, and other very unsavory groups, including many in your own country, which I don't need to name.
The National Front, they are called in Hungary, but also the Identitas movement. We do not closely monitor these organizations per se, because we do monitor when they become political parties and run for elections. But as a paramilitary groups, it's very difficult to do. We had an ally, a friend of ours, an institute that was monitoring these activities, but they don't exist anymore, unfortunately. These groups have one thing in common, which is always some sort of anti-establishment and anti-leading political culture. So they challenge also a lot of times more like the liberal values, actually, because they have a very strong social agenda, at least in their narrative, to stand up for the little people, to say what no one else wants to say. Nowadays, they are very active on the vaccination issue and being anti-vaccination, at least if it's not denying the virus, but at least to fight for liberties. And this is a very interesting trend that actually in many countries, they also stand up for the freedom of speech. So core liberties that are there, and using this narrative to become more popular, and challenging the neoliberal mainstream. And that for me, that is a very interesting thing, that actually movements that are trying to exclude other people, other identities, are also standing up for freedom in other things. And what do you think? Is this a real strategy, or is just circumstance that they do this?
No, I think it's a strategy. I think the right-wing populists, because I would include Bannon's movement in that, and incidentally, one of the main protagonists here in Montenegro in government now, in this pretty much a 20-party three-way coalition, I'm sure you're familiar. They still only have a majority of one mandate in Parliament. But one of the leaders of the Democratic Front, Nebojša Medjević, actually took his own party, the PZP, along with Brothers of Italy and the Lega in Italy, and were the troika that initiated Steve Bannon's movement. And I don't think it's coincidence that when we look at countries like Hungary or Brazil or here or India or Serbia, or anywhere else where right-wing populism is in the ascendancy, that the leaders actually link back to either Bannon or to Knights Templar. And I think that part of the reason why the right is having so much success is because they deliberately overpromise and underdeliver as a strategy. Because when they promise, oh, we will abolish all immigration, or, for example, and then they get in power and they go halfway, which is still an incredible journey to the right, everyone says, oh, look, they're not so radical after all. So they overpromise and underdeliver as part of the strategy. And that's what makes it very pernicious and makes it very dangerous, because it's seeping to the right all the time. The left overpromise and underdeliver through naivety, because the world's media is predominantly corporate and right. And maybe we could take a lesson from the right.
It depends when we define right, and because economically neoliberal, also sometimes very politically correct, and that's also quite liberal, but at the same time in the values, in terms of many risks, they are right. So it's very blurry anymore.
I don't see it that way.
It is, I think, on purpose to be a little bit blurry for everyone, because then it becomes very difficult to say who is what anymore, and it's easier to state that I'm just the people's friend. I'm not a politician. I'm not even coming from politics. Politics is evil, because I'm the savior and I'm over it already. And you see a lot of like the new challenge in France, like a historian journalist is not a. He's not born in and raised up in a political party, but coming from the outside. I have a question for you, because we mentioned already in the beginning of the conversation a Hungarian politician who wants to become the new prime minister of Hungary. He called the regime of Orbán Viktor a fascist regime. So what does it mean when someone says that a government is fascist? What does it even mean today? What do you think?
I think a regime that tries to undermine social democracy is, in a contemporary context, behaving in a fascist way. Fascism is not going to appear in our streets in jackboots and long leather coats. You know, it's far more subtle now. It's far more pernicious now.
And do you see the sign of fascism in other countries as well, or in many countries?
Yes.
What do you think about this as a European scope of the fascism of today?
I think that the countries I mentioned, the countries that are led by right-wing populists, are very much embarking on the fascist road. And I think that in many respects, the beginning of the 21st century is very, very reminiscent to the early 1930s. You know, when you've got masses of people who are totally disenfranchised, and I don't only mean economically, although we know that is the case, but they're actually disenfranchised from aspiration, then they turn to a party or to an entity that is offering them an identity, so that they can enfranchise themselves with a group of others. And the right know this, and that's why they use these vehicles, you know, these bogeymen, these fictitious enemies, like I said earlier, and they build them into straw men, because people are desperate for a sense of identity. And I think that it was interesting, before you talked about the right-wing populists can be neoliberal and so on. And I think neoliberalism economically is part of the problem. If we live in an economically catastrophic situation where we are disenfranchising the many at the expense of the corporates and the few,
And
we are going
to... I would say the very, very few, but yes.
Indeed.
Yeah, because it was never so divided in the history of mankind.
Indeed. And, you know, even in the 60s and the 70s, when I was growing up, and there was a lot of problems there, you know, we had the British National Front, we had a lot of racist comedy on TV and, you know, everything that was happening at that period. But there was still a kind of element of optimism. We could organize, we had trade unions, we had activities, we had, you know, educational places within the workplace provided by trade unions. You know, leaders like Thatcher knew that. I knew that's where the danger was. My generation, coming from, you know, humble working class backgrounds, were, you know, the first ones to get a decent education. And we didn't have to pay for it. We were actually paid to go to university. We didn't have fees. We were paid a grant to go. And, you know, what did that lead to? In the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of 30, 40 somethings coming from humble backgrounds with a good education, rising up the ladder of institutions, but with a social conscience, with a history, with an effect. And we've seen since Thatcher, Reagan, Lummis, since that period, and I include people like Blair in this, we've seen a systematic breakdown of education institutions, of help for the disenfranchised. And, you know, just being concerned with the corporate development. It's no wonder that we're in such a bad situation.
What do you think this situation will lead? Where does it end? Will it end a little bit on like a revolution, that the situation will go so wrong that repeating the 1970s, some sort of leftist revival, or more strong enforcing states with massive security and spying on people and kind of more like an Orwellian 84 type of system? What do you think the world is heading?
I think possibly we will get to the latter first, and then the former will happen. You know, in the past, the establishment has understood that you can only push people so far. If you push them really with their backs to the wall, they will rebel, they will revolt. And so, you know, during the 80s, 90s, there was a push, but not quite a push beyond any return. And certainly in the last 20 years, we've seen that push back more and more and more. And this is why I think organizations like yours are so valuable, because, you know, you are international. You know, I joined the Labour Party because I believe in internationalism. For the last however many years, that pillar, that foundation stone of the British Labour Party, one of the oldest socialist parties in the world, founded on internationalism. Yeah, internationalism has been lacking in its policies and in its outreach and solidarity. And I think that, you know, organizations like yours, and there are others as well, have an incredibly valuable role to play now.
Well, thank you. We try. That's for sure. And one pro side, and that's why I like my organizations from the very first time that I met. Of course, I didn't start it as the director. Was this pan-Europeanness of it. So we are not just EU based, but also we have a lot of connections. Even in Montenegro, we had a conference a couple of years ago. So meaning that we are not just an EU-centered organization, but actually 2/3 of United is from the post-Soviet, ex-socialist, whatever region. And this gives us a very special take on many European topics, because we have those that are trying to get in and not those that are already in and kind of bored of it, or let's say used to it so much. Some say actually, and that's my next question, is that comparing it the situation of today with the situation of 100 years before is a little bit over dramatic, because in the 30s, paramilitary units, as you said, boots and leather jackets on the street, no concentration camps now, not massive segregation of Jewish society. So are we allowed, can we be so much dramatic to compare the two together, or that's a real comparison? And in some discussions, the migration situation is often compared to the Holocaust, not in its total amount, not in the, of course, not that the borders of Europe are filled with machine guns and people are massacred, but at the same time, the sentiment, the image of the so-called enemy, as you said, the boogeyman, is now turned from the Jewish population to the migration population, or sometimes or often also political activists of the left or the progressive movement. So what do you say to those who say you are not allowed to compare these two things because one is massive and historic and sacred, and the other is today's politics, so don't compare yourself to that? What do you say to this? What do you think about this? It's a big discussion ongoing.
Yeah,
I'm curious on your opinion and take.
I actually have a little bit of a personal interest being of Jewish heritage. I happen to be an atheist, but I understand my historical culture and so on. I think it's quite wrong to compare any event to the Holocaust, because it's not about what they said were concentration camps in Bosnia, for example, or elsewhere. The Holocaust was wiping out such a huge percentage of an individual population. It actually doesn't compare to anything we see today. And I'm not diminishing anything we see today. And I think, you know, anything we see today in that regard is catastrophic, shameful, and something that we have to stand up and fight. But you cannot say it's another Holocaust. You know, the chief rabbi of England, Jonathan Sacks, I remember a number of years ago, before he was elevated to the House of Lords, gave a television Yom Kippur address from the wastelands of Sarajevo. I think that was overtly political, and I don't think there's any space in the debate for that kind of activity. But as far as comparing the rise of fascism today with that which existed in the 30s, I would suggest people who are listening to us, after this discussion, they go and Google Joseph Goebbels' speeches as early as the mid-1920s and change a few of the nouns in there and talk about immigrants or talk about Brexit or talk about, you know, other things rather than Jews, and they will find the syntax. It's the same as that which is being used today by people like Viktor Orban or people like Nigel Farage or people like Steve Bannon. You know, if you, I don't know if you saw Steve Bannon suggest to the Oxford Union a couple of years ago. You sit there and listen to the guy. He's a really intelligent guy. You know, he's a Harvard graduate, for God's sake. But it's the same kind of syntax and the same kind of structure in comments. And I think, yes, you put that alongside the mass disenfranchisement that we both agreed exists earlier. And yeah, you've got a very dangerous situation.
So we are not in the Holocaust per se, and we don't want to compare the two things, but we are in the context which is leading there. We are in the pretext of it. That's what some people say, because we said, like, there is this campaign of also United, but many other countries, many other organizations said never again. This was like a very strong statement, and we said never again, but then what we see is that it is kind of coming back again, and that's where the comparison comes, this pre-warning that if we already saw something happening in the past that led to this, then we would be insane not to call it out and not to stop it, or at least say, please consider that it happened. But of course, comparing it in itself with the Holocaust is not rightful, because of what you also said, and also the numbers, the sheer presence of the World War and everything is missing. But we also want it to be like this, and that's why we say, hey, wake up, don't do that again.
But the problem with using that comparison, people do it, and I understand that they do it, is that it almost allows people to criticize our position. Because people say, no, it's not like that. Yeah, the actions of the protagonists are the same, but the victims are much more widespread, they're much more global. They're not one specific ethnic group. The victims are actually the disenfranchised.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's different.
The victim can be a young kid in Philippines who dies of cancer with the age 14 because what he was doing for 8 years of his life was taking apart Apple phones, and that caused him cancer. So it's a way more complex system through globalization. That I agree with. What do you think? Could there be a voice of these people? Like, would there be some sort of possibility to create a global movement for these voices that highlight all the different levels of this disenfranchised people?
I mean, that would be the ideal. I think it's very difficult. There are many organizations and there are many voices out there on our side, if you like, progressive, forward-thinking, social democrats, democratic socialists. And to a large extent, very often we are concerned with fighting our own battles. You know, I'm here in Montenegro, I'm fighting the battle to maintain a constitution. Incidentally, Montenegro and its constitution is anti-fascist. Okay, and yet I see fascist behavior that happened here on September the 5th by this new government. So I've got my battle here. But I still get involved with the Black Lives Matter campaign. I get involved with campaigns from Momentum in the UK. I get involved with campaigns of women in Poland. And I do that through my Labour International Central Eastern European branch. So I'm trying to reach out and draw connections. And I think that's something that all of us, in whatever area we're working, all of us who are on the same side need to do. We need to cross-fertilize, we need to cross-participate, and we need to understand that the fight of women in Poland who want to have free and access to abortions is the same fight as Black Lives Matter. It's the same fight as the Montenegrin patriots at this moment. It's the same fight as those fighting for the rights of immigrants in Hungary. And so, you know, we need to understand that all these fights are not individual, they're all part of a collective. And we need somehow to have more forums like this, where we can discuss openly issues of, you know, a pan-Europe and pan-global matter, like the students in Hong Kong. another one. You know, we can go around the world. There are many, many, many examples, far too many to list here. But
yeah, it's impossible to scope all of them, but we see the diagnosis is evident that this struggle is always about similar issues, liberties, equality, some sort of sharing of power, pluralism, and then the subject itself doesn't matter, because from looking at from this type of objective distance, you see that they fight for very similar issues, and the nationality language is kind of different, but the cause is similar. I have a question for you, which is maybe connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in general about the so-called Antifa movement, because it's often portrayed as a violent movement, and a lot of let's say ordinary citizens say that this is not the way forward, like violence, and there is like two big roots, the non-violent movement and the more aggressive movement. What do you think about this distinction?
I don't want to talk about Antifa because Antifa doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You are either anti-fascist or you are not. And I'm very proud. I'm very proud to say I'm anti-fascist, and I don't care where it is occurring. I will stand up and fight against it. Non passerán, and you know, over my dead body, a fascist will go. And I think that this whole notion and discussion about Antifa just plays into the narrative of those who wish to discredit an anti-fascist stand.
Thank you. I very much agree. I think it's not generally one movement that is violent, but can be individuals, and often also people who are looking like, acting like, and not members of and represent. So that's a very important thing to say. But that was a discussion which we often got, and it's good to be prepared for this question, because this is something where when United says that part of us is the Antifa movement, or we are part of the Antifa movement, then this is one of the classical criticism that movement is violent and exclusive and tries to make a revolution everywhere. Instead of doing political work and education and nice things. So what do you think the strategy should be for these movements? What is the main focus? We mentioned a lot internationalism and having forums and collectively share. But what else can we do? What do you think?
The anti-fascist movement.
In general, the progressive movement, I would say.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think we have to unite. We have to recognize that it's not one battle, it's not one victory, it's a constant, and we have to get tougher, you know, and we have to reach out to each other and go to each other's meetings, address each other's meetings, bring people in. I bring into our Labour International Central Eastern Europe branch, I bring politicians in from the UK to address certain issues. We had a wonderful open meeting not long ago about Roma, and we had a British politician present, and we opened it up to regional sister parties and activists. And I think this is the way forward, or one of the ways forward.
So we are back to the old sentence, world proletariat unite. No, there's something, it was not the non-wise call. Unfortunately, it happened a little bit differently than the original founders of the movement started, because falling in Central Europe, it turned out not the way people imagined it. But I think this can happen to every ideology, because if I look at my Christian party in the parliament, I guess if Jesus invented Christianity, I think he didn't think of Orban Viktor's Christianity of today, or the church in itself. But okay, thank you very much. I think it was very fruitful, and I had a lot of thoughts coming out of it. So I hope also those who tuned in and listened to our conversations had the same. We will wrap it up, if you don't mind, which means that basically we are going to cut a little bit and edit this video and put it accessible online. I mean, it was also live, so everyone can watch it, but we'll also make a kind of like a series out of it, and of course share it with you, and use it in our 9th of November anti-fascist, anti-Semitism campaign. We try to say never again, and we are stand by it, as you said, no pasaran. And in order to do that, we have to come closer, come together and see each other struggles, and shoulder to shoulder support each other, and be critical outside and not much all the time inside, because that's also important, but still keep our values and our connections tight as well.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I enjoyed our conversation. I'd just like to end by saying that I hope you continue your sterling work, and we need more organizations like yours to outreach and educate and agitate, because that's how it's done, educate and agitate.
We'll ask you to say one last sentence or a phrase or whatever you want to call it, like a statement for young people today that are tuning into this, that are interested in the work of United or your work and all the organizations that we discussed. So what would be your message to them as a closing?
My message to the younger generation is grab the opportunity with both hands and a clear mind and the single objective to leave the world a better, fairer, more tolerant place than the one that it is now.
Thank you very much. And we will keep in touch, and I hope that we can also collaborate on other things together, and we are very happy and honored that we have a conversation.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thank you. Wait, I stop recording.